There is a thing known to every honest builder of bridges, and to almost no one else, that a building stands true, in the end, only to the reckoning that raised it, and to no other. You may cut any name you please into the foundation stone and have the whole county believe it. None of it will teach a stranger's hand to have reckoned the thrust. For a new bridge is only the last of 100 forms that were drawn and thrown away to reach it. And the throwing away is where the builder lives. A cunning man may steal a fair elevation and carry it off and set it up under his own name until no eye in the valley can tell it from his own work. But no man alive can steal the years of reckoning that stand behind it, the trials drawn and judged and struck out by the choir, the single true footing kept from among 100 near guesses. Because those are not the bridge. They are the patience and the eye that made it. And an eye cannot be forged after the fact. And the old benchmen of the trade say a harder thing still, that a well-dressed lie about who reckoned a thing will pass with every soul who wishes to believe it or fears to doubt it, which is to say with nearly everyone alive, save only the one plain person who happens to know what the true line was, because she is the one who drew it. A wall keeps its own account and cannot be argued with. A false line stands one fair season, and the first hard frost finds it out. And a bridge cannot be argued into standing on a footing it never had, and there is no fashion so admired that a second winter will not try it. And so the whole art of undoing a clever lie about the making of a standing thing is not genius at all. It is only patience, and a true eye, and the drawings and the dated books kept where no frost and no fire has reached them, and one thing carried away that nobody thought to count, and one unregarded woman that nobody troubles to watch, keeping the fabric of a house that has long since forgotten she keeps anything at all. Susannah Thorne had been at Ravensmede Court some years, and in all that time had contrived, with a good deal of care, to be very nearly invisible. She was 29 when the story finds her, a slight, plain, quiet woman with a still, level way of looking at things, brown hair bound back simply under a plain cap, and the composed, unhurried hands of a person raised to handle the exact and the weight-bearing without ever presuming to own one. She was the only daughter of Elias Thorne, who had kept a master builder's yard in the northern counties for 30 years, and who had been, besides a plain and exact and unlucky man of his trade, the finest reckoner of a stone and a strain in 3 counties, and gone no richer for it. He had raised barns and mended church towers for a wage that never once caught up with his family's wants, and he had spent every shilling he could spare and every hour he could steal from his work upon a passion the world thought an eccentricity, and that was in truth a kind of genius, the drawing of new forms, and above all of one bridge, a bridge of a bold, flat, single leap across the water, a span so long and so low that every builder he showed it to swore it must fall, and that he swore and could show upon paper would stand. He kept his boards in the loft above the yard, and there, year upon patient year, he drew and reckoned and struck out and drew again, chasing a thing most men never trouble to imagine, not a bridge copied, but a bridge made, coaxed onto the paper across 100 forms that had never stood before his hand joined this line to that. And Susannah had grown up at his elbow among the boards. Before she was 12, she had his eye, could tell a true line from a fair seeming one at a glance, and she had his hands, that could set out an arch and draw it fair when the men in the great offices gave the thing up for a fancy. And she had the whole quiet undertrade of the builder, how to keep a design book so that every line could be traced to the trial that made it, and how an honest design differs from a borrowed theft. Above all she had his creed, which he had given her at the drawing board with his plain brass plumb-bob hanging from his fingers, letting it swing to its true still upright over the edge of the board. Look, Susannah, look true. The plum does not care what the drawing says, nor what you wish. It hangs to the one true upright and shows you the wall exactly as it stands. Build to the true line, and never to the fair-seeming one. The fair-seeming line flatters and fails you, and the true one keeps faith, though not a soul is looking. A building stands true only to the reckoning that raised it, and you cannot argue a stone into bearing what it will not, nor hurry a true footing, nor fake a line you did not reckon, and a false thing, found it how you will, comes down in the end. The yard was let go when he was taken. He was found one raw March morning at his drawing board in the cold light of the loft, gone between one breath and the next, with a drawing pen still in his hand, and it undid, along with him, the only home Susannah had ever known. There was nothing to inherit but debts, a shelf of drawings nobody would buy, the plain brass plumb-bob, which she kept and keeps still, and one thing more she could not sell and would not leave, the whole living heart of his life's work, the great bridge brought within one winter of the true reckoning he had chased for 20 years and not lived to prove, the finished drawings of it, and the aged wooden model he had made with his own hands, a model with the bridge's secret built into its underside. She saved what she could carry and begged a carrier to keep the rest, and went out, as portionless gentlewomen do, to be a companion. And through the offices of a clergyman's widow who had known her father's worth, she was taken at Ravensmede Court as companion and reader to the Dowager Duchess, a great, cold, exacting old personage, then some way into a long decline, who wanted her letters read and her stiff evenings filled, and found, to her surprise, that the plain reader had a further use, for the estate was old and its fabric failing, and it was discovered, almost by accident, that the quiet companion with the builder's brass plumb could tell the steward what no hired surveyor from the town could tell him, which cracked wall was only settling, and which was going, and where the old gate tower had begun to lean, and what was drawing it down. She read a building the way other people read a face. So Susannah Thorne stayed on as the unregarded real keeper of the estate's fabric, which was no office known to the peerage and carried no dignity whatever, and went about the failing walls with her father's plum in her apron and his rule in her basket, sounding and reckoning and setting right, and the household, when it thought of her at all, thought of her as it thought of the mason's tools, a useful, silent, unregarded thing that was noticed only on the rare day it was wanted, and not to hand. And in her own hours, the early mornings before the house woke, the long light evenings that were her own, Susannah Thorne did the thing she had never told a living soul at Ravensmede that she did. She reckoned a bridge. She had carried her father's drawings and his model with her, and set up a board in a forgotten muniment room behind the disused estate presses, where the old plans of the property mouldered and no one ever came. And there, patiently, across the seasons, she took up the work he had been taken from unfinished. She drew the bold span again and again. She reckoned the thrust of it and the load it must carry. She tried footing after footing, and struck out the ones that would not hold, keeping the 1 in 100 that carried the thing forward, and she wrote it all down, as he had taught her, in a plain dated design book, every trial and every casting out set down in her small clear hand, with his own private marks in the margins, a little true upright drawn beside a form that would stand, a firm stroke through the ones she had judged and thrown away. It was the whole diary of her heart. Since she kept no other, her long loneliness was in that book, and her lost father, and a stubborn private hope. All of it turned into the slow making of a bridge, because the drawing board was the one country in which a portionless companion was rich. And one hard winter, Bent over the board by a single candle, she saw the last of it come clear. The thing her father had chased and not lived to fix. How so bold and flat a span could be made to stand. By a deep, relieving arch sunk out of sight in the footing of the middle pier. An arch no eye would ever see in the finished bridge, that would take the great thrust the fair face could not, and pass it down into the rock, so that the leap every honest builder swore must fall would stand 100 years and look as light as a ribbon thrown across the water. She had fixed it. She had finished his life's work, and drawn besides the crown he had dreamed to answer it, a great gateway to stand at the valley's mouth. She told no one. She half believed that a companion who reckoned bridges in secret was a slightly absurd thing. A woman reaching after a greatness that was no business of hers. People taught by the world that they are worth nothing learn to say it first themselves, to get the sting out of it. And so the boldest bridge in England lay unbuilt and unseen in a locked press, kept by a woman the house looked straight through, and known to one living person who was she. There was one person at Ravensmede who guessed a little of it and loved her for it, and she was the one bright thing in Susannah's grown life, the Duke's younger sister, Lady Cecilia. Lady Cecilia was everything Susannah was not. Warm, quick, laughing, adored, and she had a real, untutored delight in the old plans and drawings of the estate, and had found Susannah out one wet afternoon in the muniment room bent over her board with the great bridge half drawn before her, and had not been got rid of after. "Susannah Thorne," she had said, turning the drawing to the light with shining eyes, "I have never seen that bridge standing in any park in my life, and I have seen a great many. Where did it come from?" And Susannah, caught, had said it was nothing, an old fancy of her father's, and Lady Cecilia, who for all her lightness was nobody's fool, had looked from the drawing to Susannah's face and said, "You reckoned that. Do not you dare tell me you did not, for I can see it in you." It was the nearest to being seen that Susannah Thorne had ever come. But Lady Cecilia married that autumn, a good, plain, loving man with an estate away in the north, and went away from Ravensmede as bright sisters do, and she carried, unregarded among 100 happy new things, the knowledge that the quiet companion reckoned bridges no other hand could reckon, and never once thought to say so aloud to the drawing-room. Because why would she? Nobody asked, and so the one witness who could have spoken for Susannah was 300 miles away and thinking of other things, and Susannah turned her pages alone and said nothing, and was, on the whole, not unhappy, because the bridge was coming true on the paper, and the work was good, and the mornings were her own. The master of the house she scarcely knew, and feared a little, as the whole household did. Julian, Duke of Ravensmede, was 38, and had been, in his youth, by every account, a warmer and an easier man than the one who now ruled the court with a cold, exact, unresting reserve. What had frozen him was not grief, but betrayal. As a very young man, newly come to his title and his vast responsibilities and knowing nothing, he had trusted the running of half his affairs to a charming, plausible, universally recommended man of business, a man everyone vouched for, who wore honesty like a well-cut coat, and that man had robbed him coolly for 3 years, dressing the theft in friendship the whole while, and had very nearly brought the great estate down before an old steward caught it. And the worst of it was not the money but the discovery of how completely and how long he had been fooled, how the warmth had all been counterfeit and he too green to see it. He had never been fooled again, because he had made very sure of it, at a price. He had grown watchful and dry and shut. He prized loyalty above every other virtue, and despised above every other vice the climber, the flatterer, the smooth-reaching soul, who works upward by charm and by lies, and he had walled his heart so high that the county thought him proud and cold, and were not altogether wrong. His one warm and unguarded feeling in the world was for his mother. He knew the old dowager to be proud and difficult and often unkind, and he loved her without the least illusion, and with his whole hidden heart. And it grieved him past speech to watch her fail, and when he cast about for some gift that might give her joy in her last years, he had lit on the one place she had ever truly loved. The wooded valley below the court, with its old fallen bridge, where she had walked as a young bride and where the ruin of years had crept sadly over the banks, and he had resolved to have it made glorious again, and crowned with a great new bridge, and laid at her feet while she could still delight in it. It was the one hopeful, tender, softening project of his shut life. And to accomplish it he sent, of course, for the most celebrated man in England. Mr. Hector Dallow was that not uncommon figure of the age, a genius of trade who had made himself a gentleman by sheer force of taste and application. He had begun, it was whispered, and he never denied it, in a builder's yard, and he had risen, by a real eye for a line and a far greater eye for a fashion, and a manner that charmed duchesses, and a tongue that could sell a plain thing as a wonder, to be the arbiter and improver of every great park in the kingdom, the man whose new works set the mode, whose word made or unmade a lesser architect, who walked among the great as an equal, because the great could not do without him. He was a large, handsome, warm-mannered man of about 45, with an easy laugh and an air of bluff open honesty that was the most finished thing about him. And he came down to Ravensmede with an army of men and a great scheme, and set about the ruined valley. And it was there, going one evening where he had no business to go, into the old muniment room, that he came upon Susannah Thorne's drawings and the aged wooden model standing beside them. She was not by. He stood a long time before the bold, flat span, very still, in a way that one of the laborers who watched him from the yard door never forgot, and he knew, in one breath, exactly what he was looking at, because a man who has spent 40 years pricing works can price the priceless in a heartbeat. It was worth more than a fortune. It was worth the one thing his risen soul still hungered for, and money could not buy, which was to be not merely the builder of great men's parks, but the maker of the boldest bridge in the kingdom. To have his name live in a span, men would come miles to see long after the fashion had forgotten his office. He made inquiry, carefully, and learned that the room was the private ground of the dowager's gray companion. A nobody, a portionless woman who tuned the old lady's evenings and went about the walls with a plumb line. And Mr. Hector Dallow, who had climbed too far to be squeamish, began, very gently, to smile. He tried first to buy it, in his warm open way as one builder to another, and Susannah Thorne disliked him from the first word, and did not trust him the length of the gallery. He praised her drawings generously. He offered, most handsomely, to bring the poor neglected design out properly, to work it up at his own famous office and lay it before the world, with full and grateful acknowledgment of the hand that first sketched it. And Susannah, who heard the shape of the thing under the warmth, as clearly as she heard a false note in a wall, thanked him quietly, and gave him nothing, and let him believe her a fool. He came again, less warmly, and named a sum that would have kept her in modest comfort for the rest of her life, for the whole of the drawings and the reckonings and the maker's rights, and she refused it, gently, and he went away that time not smiling, for a man like Dallow does not forgive being refused a thing he has already, in the counting-house of his mind, spent and sold. But there was nothing to be done by force. The drawings were hers, on her own ground, and she guarded them close, And so Mr. Dallow, who was a patient man and a thief only where thieving was safe, said no more, and finished the Duke's other works with celebrated skill, and won the whole gratitude of the house, and bided his time. And in the autumn, when the presses were being turned out and the muniment room stood open for the labor, a single drawing went missing from the bottom of Susannah's press, one of the near ones, an elevation of the middle sort, and, a little while after, her design book was found by her one morning not quite as she had left it. The tie knotted wrong, and she stood very still, and understood that she had been read, and told herself she must be imagining it, because the alternative was too large and too frightening for a companion to say out loud. What Mr. Dallow carried away was not, of course, her true bridge. It was the cast-off intermediate, an elevation 3 trials back in the work, the one she had noted in her book and struck out for a fault, the bold flat span drawn without the deep relieving arch beneath, a fair face upon a footing that could not truly carry it, a span that would stand handsome for a season, and then spread and crack the first winter. A hard frost went into the ground beneath its piers. The very fault she had judged and thrown away on the road to the true reckoning. He had besides a covert reading of her dated book, hurried and stolen, enough to carry off the bridge's whole shape and story, and even, had he been builder enough to weigh it, the secret of how it truly stood. But Mr. Dallow was a man of taste, and not of true reckoning. And when his stolen reading spoke of a deep arch to be sunk out of sight beneath the middle pier, at great cost, below the very water, he took it for old-fashioned masons' over-caution, a waste no modern eye would pay for, and no part of how so handsome a span would stand. And so he left it out. The stolen drawing was bold enough, and flat enough, and glorious enough on the paper to deceive every eye in England but hers. And it was, above all, unreckoned in its heart. It would spread, and it would come untrue in time. But Mr. Dallow did not mean to reckon it. He meant to build it and be crowned. And by the time it faltered, his fame would be made and past unmaking. And so he brought it out, grandly, under the full weight of the family's authority, exactly as a clever thief brings out a stolen thing, fast and public, and wrapped in a sentiment no one would dare to question. He built the bold span across the Duke's restored water, a fair flat face upon a common footing, with no sunk arch beneath it at all. And the next midsummer, at the great meeting of the celebrated Society of Arts that the whole fashionable world attended, Mr. Hector Dallow unveiled, to gasps and to applause that made his name forever, a bridge of extraordinary boldness such as no one had seen, a single flat leap of pale stone across the water light as a ribbon, which he had reckoned across long and patient years, and which he begged leave to name, in honor of the great lady whose valley he had lately restored, and whose failing health was known and mourned, the Ravensmede Bridge. It was a triumph beyond even Dallow's hopes. There is nothing the world loves like a bold thing wrapped in a tender story. And here were both, crowned with a duke's patronage and a failing lady's name. And the bridge itself was undeniably magnificent in that first summer, which no puffery can manufacture, and carried the whole thing on its own bold beauty into the admiration of the kingdom. The Society's High Committee gave him its gold medal. The whole fashionable world drove out to marvel that so long a leap could be made so flat and so light it was drawn, and engraved and praised and sung over, and Mr. Dallow, its supposed reckoner, found himself lifted from the first of fashionable architects to something like an artist, a man of genius. And the Duke of Ravensmede, watching his cold, proud, failing mother's worn face light with a joy he had not seen upon it in 20 years, as she was carried down to see her ruined valley crowned with the kingdom's boldest bridge, and to hear that it bore her name, felt the one clean happiness his shut heart had known in longer than he could remember, and was grateful, grateful to the bridge, and grateful, above all and most dangerously, to the good, bluff, devoted Mr. Dallow, who had wrought this gift for a failing woman and asked nothing for himself but the joy of serving a great house. The Duke's gratitude to Dallow became, that summer, one of the fixed facts of Ravensmede, as solid as the walls. It is worth marking, because everything that followed had to break itself against it. Susannah Thorne stood in the crowd at the unveiling, in her gray gown, and watched a man she knew to be a thief receive a gold medal for her father's bridge under a false name, and said nothing, and thought she would be quietly sick. And then she went home to Ravensmede, and said nothing there either, for longer than you would think a person could bear. A life of being worth nothing teaches you to expect nothing, and to distrust your own claims first of all, and the thing was so enormous, and she so small, that to speak seemed not brave but mad. And there was the Dowager. That was the thing that held her tongue past the point she could afterward forgive in herself. The old lady's joy in the bridge that bore her name was the one warmth of her failing life. She spoke of it daily. She believed, with her whole proud heart, that her valley had crowned her age with glory, and it had given her something to set against the dark. And Susannah could not see how to claim her own without tearing that from a failing woman, without standing up to say that the great lady's bridge was a stolen thing and the great lady herself the innocent front of a fraud. So she was silent, and told herself the bridge was doing good where it was, giving joy, and that nothing so small as whose hand had truly reckoned it could matter beside an old woman's comfort at the end. And she almost made it hold. What broke it was Dallow's greed, which was larger than his caution. The triumph went to his head, and the world clamored for more, and it was announced that the great maker was even now reckoning a companion to his masterwork, a triumphal gateway of the same bold stone to stand at the valley's mouth, finer than the span itself. To be unveiled at the grand opening the Duke was to give the following summer a public crowning of the whole restored valley to which the kingdom of taste would come. But Mr. Dallow had no gateway. Because he had never reckoned the bridge, he had a stolen cast-off drawing that had taught him nothing of how to make a new bold thing stand. And he knew it, and so he came back to Ravensmede that autumn, all warmth and welcome as the honored restorer of the valley, and began to go about the old muniment room and the presses with a covetous, searching eye, and Susannah learned from old Enoch, the clerk of the works who had known her father, and was her one ally in that place, what she had most dreaded. Enoch came to her white in the face. Mr. Dallow, he said, had been asking him, careless like over a pipe, whether the gray companion had any better drawings than the ones he had seen, any set she kept back, private, the true reckoning, and had let fall that he had heard tell of the whole design, the real one, with the sunk arch and the gateway and all, and meant to have a proper look at it before he went. And Susannah Thorne went cold in the muniment room, hearing it, for she knew exactly what the whole design was. It was the true master set, the finished reckoning her father had chased and she had fixed, with the deep relieving arch drawn plain in the foundation sections, and the great gateway to crown it, of which there existed one set in all the world, and no copy anywhere, and which she had shown to no living soul, and beside it the aged model with the secret built into its underside. Dallow had caught the scent of it, and meant to steal it too, to take the last and best thing, and drive his own name into the stone beside it and sell it to the world. He meant to take the true one, and something in Susannah Thorne that a lifetime of worth nothing had never quite killed stood up at last and said, "No, not that one." She went about it even then as gently as it could be gone about, because she was Elias Thorne's daughter and did not know how to be otherwise, and because she still wished above all to shield the dowager. She did not go to the county. She did not make a clamor. She went privately, hat in hand, to the two people she thought had a right to hear it first, to Mr. Dallow himself, and then, when that failed as it was always going to fail, to the Duke. To Dallow she said only, quietly, standing among the very presses he had robbed, that she believed he knew as well as she did whose the bridge truly was, that she would ask nothing about the span already built and praised, would raise no clamor, would let the dowager keep her joy and her name upon the bridge exactly as it stood, if only he would let the true design alone, and take no more. It was, she thought, a fair and merciful offer. It cost him only a greed he had no right to. Mr. Dallow heard her out with his easy smile never leaving his face, and she understood before he answered that she had made a bad mistake, had shown a dangerous man exactly where she was dangerous, and exactly how little she meant to fight, which to a man like Dallow is not mercy but weakness, and weakness is an opportunity. "My dear Miss Thorne," he said, warm as ever, "you have overtired yourself among these old papers, and you have brooded alone until you have got a very strange fancy into your head. It is a thing one sees in solitary women who have lived too long in the shadow of the great. Let me give you some friendly advice. Say this to nobody at all, for if you do, I promise you it will not be believed, and it will not be forgiven, and you will find the world has a very short way with an obscure dependent who tries to climb into notice by pulling down her betters." And he touched his hat to her pleasantly, and went that same week, and did the thing she should have known he would do, went to the Duke first, and salted the ground before she could stand on it. For Dallow understood the Duke's nature the way Susannah understood a wall, and knew exactly where to press. He did not bluster. He went to the Duke grave and reluctant, a bluff, honest man forced to a painful duty, and said it distressed him beyond anything to bring his grace such a thing. But he could not in conscience hold it back, that the dowager's companion, that quiet Miss Thorne his grace had likely never noticed, had grown strange and unsettled solitary women did, and had begun to make a wild and painful claim, that she was going about to say the great bridge was her own, stolen from her, and meant, he feared, to make a public scandal of it, that it was, of course, a sad delusion, the sort that fastens on lonely dependents who come to fancy their master's glories their own, but that it had its dangerous side, for if such a tale got abroad, it might cast a shadow, however unjust, upon her ladyship's honored name, and poison the one joy of her last days, and that his grace should be warned, and the poor woman gently but firmly checked before her fancy did the failing Duchess a public cruelty. It was beautifully done. It was once again the exact truth turned precisely inside out, which is always the strongest lie, and it armed the Duke against the one thing Susannah could bring, for it told him in advance that she would come with just this story, and taught him to hear the true account when it came, as the raving of a grasping mind. And it wrapped the whole in the two things the Duke could not think past: his love for his mother, and his lifelong horror of the climber who works upward by lies. To disbelieve Dallow was now, in the Duke's armored heart, to expose his failing mother to a scandal at the word of a scheming inferior. Dallow had made the truth itself an attack on the old lady's peace, and made Susannah the very kind of plausible reaching deceiver the Duke had sworn never to be fooled by again. There is no crueler trap to set for such a man, and no surer. So that when Susannah Thorne, some days later, gathered the whole of her small courage and stood in the Duke's library, a long, cold room, where the ordered evidence of a great, guarded life pressed in from every wall, and told him, plainly and quietly, that the celebrated bridge was her own reckoning, drawn across years by her own hand and her father's before her, and that she had proof of it, and wished only to be believed and to keep the last of the design from the same theft. She was speaking into ground salted against her a week before, and never had a chance. She saw a terrible hope leap up in his face and be crushed for one instant, hearing her steady, particular, wholly, unhysterical account. Some part of the Duke had wondered. And then Dallow's warning took, and the wondering closed over into a cold and pitying anger. The anger of a man told in advance that this grasping fantasy was coming, who now watches it arrive exactly on schedule. He did not rage. The anger of such men is quiet, and worse. He said he had been warned to expect precisely this, and had hoped he had been misinformed. He said he had made every allowance for her solitary situation and her long service and the strange turns a lonely mind may take, and would make one more, and not turn her out of doors that night. He said she would never, so long as she drew breath, repeat this thing to any living soul, that if one shadow fell across his mother's name from this squalid invention, she would learn what the anger of his house could do to a friendless woman. And then he said the thing she carried longest, because he said it not in fury, but in a weary contempt, looking at her as at something that had disappointed him past expectation. I had taken you, at least, for an honest woman. I see I mistook you, as I have learned to expect to be mistaken in people who reach above themselves. It is the oldest trick there is, to try to climb into a great name over the body of the one who made it. Get out of my sight, and be grateful I do not trouble to ruin you. And Susannah Thorne, with her design book still folded and untouched in her hand, for you cannot make a man who has been warned examine your proof. The very offering of it is only more of the madness he was promised, curtsied, and went out, and did not weep until she was 3 floors up in the dark of her own room, and then only a little, being long out of the habit of expecting better. The Dowager finished it the next morning, and it was the Dowager who made it absolute. Dallow had gone to her too, gently, and the old lady had swallowed the tale whole, because he told it well, and because to believe it cost her nothing, and to doubt it would have cost her the one joy of her age, and to her the companion's claim was not merely false, but a personal outrage. A low creature she had fed and sheltered reaching up out of the servants' passage to snatch the crown from her failing head. She had Susannah brought before her, and did what the grief-worn and gentler Duke had not quite done, cast her off, formally, coldly, and entirely. Miss Thorne was dismissed the Dowager's service and would be gone from Ravensmede by the week's end. She would be given no character, no letter of any kind, for how, said the Dowager, her old voice like a closing door, could she in conscience recommend to any decent household a woman capable of this ingratitude? And she might think herself fortunate to be let go, quietly and not exposed. Susannah heard it out with her hands folded and her face still, because she had learned very young that when the great have decided to be unjust, the only dignity left to the small is not to writhe, and she said, at the end, only, "Very well, your grace. I am sorry to have grieved you, that was never my wish. I will be gone as you say." And she went out to the valley in the last of the light, to the bold bridge she knew for her father's and her own, and stood a while looking at the long flat leap of it pale against the dark water, and then went up to pack her box, and the great house of Ravensmede was rid of the one person in it who had ever reckoned a work worth the name and did not know it. There remains the hardest hour, the one that decides everything. And it came that same night. For Susannah Thorne's real trial was not the losing of her place, which she had half expected all her life. It was the thing she had to choose, alone, in a cold room, with a hard frost coming down. She could not carry a bridge away in a companion's box, but she could carry the whole heart of it. And she went out by dark, with old Enoch keeping watch and saying nothing, and lifted from the locked press the true master set, the finished drawings with the sunk arch drawn plain in the foundation sections and the great gateway to crown it, and her dated design book, the whole record in her own hand, and, wrapped last and most carefully, her father's aged wooden model of the true bridge, with the secret arch built into its underside. And she carried them, in a carrier's cart, to the poor lodging she had taken over a wheelwright's shop in the market town of Gildon Cross, 8 miles off, where she was set down with her box and her roll and her model in the black cold of 2 in the morning. And there, that first night, the thing was put to her plainly. There was a hard black frost settling, the killing kind, the kind that finds out a false footing and takes the warmth out of a living body by dawn, and she had in that bare room a handful of coal and no more, fuel enough for one small mean fire that might just keep the life in her till morning, and beside it dry and worth more to a freezing woman than any coal. The great roll of her father's drawings, and the seasoned old wood of the model, which would burn hot and long and carry her warm through the worst night of her life. And she sat on the floor a long time between the two. And it was not, as you might think, an easy choice, for she was cold to the bone and frightened and utterly alone, and the bridge had already cost her everything. And there was a voice in her, small and reasonable and very tired, that said, "Burn them. Burn the drawings and the book and the old toy of a model, and be warm, and let the whole ruinous business go up the chimney tonight. No one will ever know. You cannot win. A great man's word will crush your dated scribbles like a moth, and if the true design burns here in the dark, then the theft is ended with it, and the dowager keeps her joy, and you keep your peace, and who is harmed? Let it all go, and be warm." And Susannah Thorne took her father's plain brass plumb-bob out of her pocket, and held it, and let it hang true and still from her cold fingers in the firelight, and did not burn them. She fed the mean little fire nothing but its handful of coal, and wrapped the roll of drawings and the model in her own shawl and then in her cloak, and sat the rest of that black night against the wall with her arms about her knees, shivering, keeping the true bridge whole with the warmth she denied herself, because you build to the true line and not the fair-seeming one. And the fair-seeming thing that night was to be warm, and the true thing was a roll of a lost man's reckoning that no soul in the world but she believed in. In the gray of the morning the frost lay white on the inside of the glass and thick on the sill, and the drawings and the model were whole, and so was she, and that, and not anything that came after, was the moment Susannah Thorne won, though it would be a year before a single other person knew there had been a battle at all. She took up, in Gildon Cross, her father's honest trade, or as much of it as a poor woman might. There was a master builder near the town, a plain, blunt, close-mouthed old man of great and quiet repute, named Reuben Stott, once a famous reckoner of works in his London days, driven to the country by his chest, plain in his coat and plainer in his speech, honest as the daylight and proud of nothing but his trade, and he took Susannah on, first to make fair drawings for his estimates, and then, finding what she knew, to reckon his thrusts and check his footings and keep his design book, paying her a pittance and treating her, which was rarer, as one who knew her business. She lived very poor and very quiet, and set up her few rescued drawings and the model in a corner of her lodging where no damp could reach them. And she said nothing to anyone of where they came from, and nothing of the great bridge that was that very summer, being praised in every fashionable park in the kingdom under a great lady's name and a thief's reckoning. She heard it praised. She could not help but hear it. The whole country talked of the Ravensmede Bridge, and of the genius Mr. Dallow, and of the grand opening to come, and the great gateway that was to crown it. And Susannah Thorne drew her plans and reckoned her footings, and kept her own counsel in her father's book, and endured, which is a quiet thing, and looks like nothing, and is the hardest labor there is. And then the bridge began to tell the truth, because stone cannot help it, whatever name is cut in the foundation. In its second winter, the winter before the grand opening, the Ravensmede Bridge came untrue. The first hard black frost of the season drove deep into the wet ground beneath the false-footed piers, and the earth heaved as it froze. And the great bold span that had no sunk relieving arch to gather its thrust and pass it down into the rock began, quietly at first and then not quietly, to spread at the haunches and settle at the crown. A crack opened in the soffit and ran and widened. The parapet bulged and went visibly out of the true, so that a man at the bank could see the long light leap that had been the wonder of the kingdom beginning to sag and come apart, did, in short, exactly the fault that Susannah Thorne had recorded in her book 3 trials back as her reason for casting an unreckoned intermediate out of the work. It was not ill fortune, and it was not bad building, though Dallow swore desperately that it was both a hard season and a drunken mason. It was the reckoning. It was an unreckoned span upon a false footing spreading as it had always been going to spread, coming untrue as a stolen thing comes untrue, in its own good time, before all the world. And Mr. Hector Dallow, who had promised the kingdom a perfected gateway finer than the bridge for the grand opening now almost upon him, found himself unable to mend the span he had never truly reckoned, unable to raise a second bold thing from a stolen drawing that gave him nothing, and facing, for the first time in his risen life, the near prospect of a public and ruinous failure at the summit of his fame. It was old Reuben Stott who first said the thing aloud, because he had the eye and no reason on earth to flatter anyone. He had gone over to look at the famous bridge, as every builder in the county had gone, and he stood before it in its faltering second winter one raw morning, running his blunt thumb along the opening crack with a face like thunder, and said, to no one in his plain way, this was never reckoned. Thee cannot tell me a true founded span spreads and cracks like this in one frost. There is no relieving arch sunk under yon middle pier to carry it. The footing is a fair face upon nothing, and half the county gulled. And Susannah Thorne, checking an estimate at the bench behind him when he came back grumbling to the yard, went very still, and after a while quietly, because she had carried it alone as long as she could, and here at last was a man who might understand. She said, Mist, Stott, I can show you what it is. And she brought out her book, and she laid before that honest old man the dated trials of the bridge in her own hand, and, when he asked, the drawings and the aged model themselves, the parent form. The false-footed intermediate struck through in the book with a note, and last the true master set, with the deep relieving arch drawn plain in the foundation sections, and the great gateway to crown it, the fixed and finished reckoning that no one in the world had ever seen. And Reuben Stott, who had spent 50 years raising works and could not be deceived in a footing by any power under heaven, went through it slowly, and grew pale, and sat down, and at the end he took off his spectacles and looked at the gray, quiet woman at his bench as though he had never truly seen her, and said, "Every line of it is thine." The great Mr. Dallow never reckoned a bridge in his life. He stole a lost man's work and a live woman's, and built the county the cast off middle drawing, and left out the very arch that would have held it up. I have been in this trade 50 years, and I never saw the like. And then, being an honest man and a practical one, he told her the two hard things she needed to hear. The first was a warning, and it was the same warning old craftsmen have always given, the same in its bones that a clever man had used against her as a threat, that her word would carry nothing. "Thee must understand," Stott said heavily, "that if thee stands up and says it, thy word against his, thee will be crushed. He is Mr. Dallow, and thee a dismissed companion he has already named a madwoman. A plain woman's truth against a famous man's smile is no contest at all, and they will hear thee as the grasping fraud he has told them to hear. Thee must not say it. Thee must show it. Thee must put the thing itself into their hands, where a stranger can test it and be forced to believe it whether he likes thee or no. The dated book, the true drawings, the fault in his bridge, and above all the one thing he cannot match, the true reckoning with the sunk arch, and the plain proof under the water that his bridge has none. And thee must do it before the Duke himself, and before men who know a building, at a time and place where the stone can answer for thee, since thy voice never will." And the second thing Reuben Stott did, that very week, without being asked, was to take Susannah's book and drawings and go with her before a plain attorney in Gilden Cross, and there, on his own long professional oath as a master of the trade, swear and sign and lodge a dated certificate that he had examined the drawings and reckonings of Susannah Thorne, and did solemnly attest them the true and only record of the design the world called the Ravensmede Bridge, together with a further design unbuilt, so that whatever fire or frost or great man's anger came, the truth should be set down and dated and safe beyond any man's power to burn. "Now," said old Stott, tying the drawings up again in their ribbon, "it is not only in thy hand and thy model, it is in the law's cold keeping too. Let him try his word against that." And meanwhile, at Ravensmede, the trap the Duke had set for himself was closing from the other side, driven by the one part of his nature Dallow had never reckoned with, his exactness. The Duke did not know an arch from an architrave, but he could not endure a thing that did not add up. And the failing of the great bridge did not add up. He had watched his mother's joy curdle into distress as the span that bore her name cracked and sagged in her own restored valley. He had watched the celebrated Mr. Dallow grow evasive and overwarm and full of excuses, promising a gateway that never came nearer, and something cold and watchful in the Duke, the very faculty his long ago betrayal had honed to a razor, had begun quietly to attend. And two things came to trouble him further. The first was his mother herself, who, fretting over her failing bridge in her weakness, had begun to ask querulously and often why the quiet Thorne woman had been sent away, the one who could read any wall and tell you true what ailed it, and whether she might not be got back to save the bridge, seeming to have forgotten, in her decline, that it was she who had cast her out. The second was Lady Cecilia, come down from the north to see her mother, who heard the whole story of the dismissed companion and the disputed bridge, and turned white, and then turned on her brother with all the warmth of a woman who has seen a plain truth the clever have missed. "Julian," she said, You great, blind, proud fool. The drawings were always Susannah Thorne's. I saw them myself, years ago, in the old muniment room, before ever Dallow set foot here. I held the true design in my own hands, and she owned to me she had reckoned it. And I have never forgotten it, because I never saw its equal. You have sent away the only person in England who can save our mother's bridge, and called her a thief for making the very thing your fine Mr. Dallow is dead for stealing. And the Duke of Ravensmede sat very still under that, and did not sleep, for he was a proud man and a hard one, but not, at the bottom, a stupid one, nor a wilfully unjust one. And a cold suspicion he could not put down had begun to grow that he had been fooled again, worse than before, by the same arts, and had crushed the honest one, and crowned the thief with his own hands. And so, because he could not bear an account that would not balance, and because his mother fretted for her bridge, and because his sister had looked at him with contempt, he did the thing that undid Dallow. He sent privately, telling Dallow nothing, to the market town of Gilden Cross for the dismissed companion who was said to have the true hand with the works, meaning only to save his mother's bridge, and not yet dreaming that he was sending for the woman who had made it. Susannah Thorne read the Duke's cold civil note, a summons, near enough to attend at Ravensmede and give her opinion on the ailing bridge, with no word of apology and none of accusation, only the flat assumption that she would come when a duke called, and she sat with it a long while. And then she went to Old Stott, and they talked late, and she resolved to go, not to plead, for she had learned what her pleading was worth, not to accuse, for her accusing would be called madness. She would go, and take her book and her drawings and the aged model wrapped like the treasure it was, and she would answer the Duke's question about his mother's bridge with the plain truth of what it was, and let the stone, and not her worthless word, carry it before whatever company was gathered, and she prayed it would be gathered. For a thing shown to one proud man in private can be denied, but a thing shown to a room of people who know a building cannot. And as it happened, chance was kind, for the day the Duke had named fell but 3 days before the grand opening itself. And when Susannah Thorne came up the long drive to Ravensmede in Stott's cart, with her roll and her model on her knee, she came into a house and valley already filling with the whole world of taste and building, the committee of the great society, the fashionable and the knowing, the raising of tents, and the setting of scaffolds about the cracked and shored-up bridge, and, moving among it all as its presiding genius, warm and bluff and indispensable, and not yet knowing that the one person on earth who could unmake him had just been handed down at his own triumphant gate. Mr. Hector Dallow. They received her at first as a tradeswoman come about a sick structure, and it was in the great hall of the court, before more people than the Duke had meant, and fewer than Susannah had hoped, that the thing at last came to its head. The Duke there, cold and watchful, the Dowager brought in her wheeled chair, frail and sharp and clutching after her failing bridge, Lady Cecilia at her mother's side with her eyes on her brother, old Enoch fetched up from the works trembling with hope, some half-dozen of the society's committee, men who knew a building and had come about the scandal of the cracking span, and Dallow, who had come in easy and smiling to see off whatever drab builder had been called to fuss over the stone, and who stopped 1/2 second when he saw who it was, and then came on smiling, because a man does not climb as high as Dallow had by losing his countenance in public. The Duke bade Susannah, civilly and coldly, to look at the bridge and say what ailed it, and Susannah Thorne did not then say what he expected, which was some builder's talk of a hard season and a poor foundation. She said quietly into the whole listening hall, "Your Grace, there is nothing wrong with the building of it that any workman did. What ails it is what it is. It is a bold design, but an unreckoned one, 3 parts of the way to a true bridge and no further, and it was drawn to spread and crack in just this way in its 2nd winter, which is why it was thrown away. If your Grace will allow me, I will not tell you that. I will show it you, and you may believe your own eyes and these gentlemen's, and not my word, which I know is worth nothing here." And she asked for a table, and they gave her one, and she laid out upon it, in the clear light of the tall windows, the whole of her case in the order her father had taught her, never asking a man to take her word where she could put the thing itself into his hand. She set down first her father's brass plumb-bob, and hung it through the great window against the far shored-up span itself, and showed them what any eye could now see once it was told where to look, that the famous bridge no longer stood true, that its crown had settled and its piers leaned and its parapet ran out of the upright, the plumb line hanging plainly aslant of the stone. Then she laid beside the plumb her own dated trials, in her own hand, the parent form, the intermediate, with its false footing and its spreading fault written out and dated 3 years gone, and she showed how the celebrated bridge answered the thrown-away intermediate line for line and fault for fault, the very crack and the very spread, so that whoever had shown it to the world had built from a drawing she had judged and discarded, and could not have got it save from her own struck-out press. Then she opened her design book to the daylight, and let the committee men turn its dated pages, the whole bridge worked out year upon year, every trial and every casting out set down as it happened, and could not be set down after, the visible labor of a thing being made. And beside the book she gave them the test, plainly, so that no man there need take anything on her word. This span is failing for one reason only. It has no relieving arch sunk beneath the middle pier to carry the thrust of so bold a leap. And mine has. Send men down to the foot of the middle pier, under the water, and see whether there is such an arch there or no. If there is, I am a liar, and if there is not, then it was built from a drawing that never had one, and I will tell you whose that was. And the committee men bent over the book, and murmured, and one of them, a knowing old builder, looked up at Dallow with a very strange expression beginning on his face. And then, last, while the hall held its breath, Susannah Thorne lifted from its wrappings the aged wooden model her father had made with his own hands years before, and set it on the table, and turned it over, so its underside showed to the room. And there, built into the sunk footing of the middle pier, plain to every eye, was the deep relieving arch. The whole secret of how so bold a span could stand, the finished true thing carried one step further than the thief had ever been able to follow. Worked in old and honest wood and gray with the dust of years, a reckoning such as not one soul in that hall had ever seen. And there was a silence, because there was nothing to say against it. It was so plainly the true source of the very bridge the book and the drawings had just walked them up to, that the case was complete before she had said a single word more. And Mr. Hector Dallow, cornered at last in the one place where his word could not save him, did the thing cornered clever men do, which is to strike first and hardest, and stake everything on brazening it through. He laughed warmly, spread his hands, and appealed to the room over the head of the gray woman as a man of sense appealing about a poor lunatic. He said it was the saddest thing in the world, that he had warned his Grace a year ago this very delusion would come to just this, that the woman was a builder's drab of some small cunning, who had spent years about his lordship's works, and had memorized his, Dallow's, drawings, and had now got up a parcel of scribbled papers and an old toy of a model and cooked the whole into a fraud, working on his Grace's known love for the Duchess to steal a great man's life's work. That her so-called book was a forgery she had scrawled this 12-month past in her lodging, and that as for her precious secret reckoning, this arch she made such a mystery of. And here his contempt ran ahead of his cunning. Here the climber's need to be the cleverest man in the room reached one fatal half-inch past what a safe man would have said. As for that, why, I know all about her famous hidden arch. It is nothing but that bit of buried trumpery she has sunk away under the middle pier where no eye can see it nor ever check it. An old mason's waist she keeps back on purpose to make a mystery of, and I dare say she has. And he stopped. He stopped because he heard it. He heard it the same half-second the whole hall heard it, and his warm face froze on the words. For no living soul but Susannah had ever seen the relieving arch sunk beneath the middle pier. It stood in no drawing that any stranger could read. It was invisible in the finished bridge, buried under the stone and the water. It had been built into no span in the world, for his own bridge had none. And the one person on earth who could have known that an arch stood sunk and hidden at the foot of that particular pier in her design was the man who had gone hunting through her book and her press in the dark to steal the true reckoning, and had caught just enough of it to know the arch was there and just too little to understand that he must build it. He had, in his one greedy half-second of needing to seem to know everything, described the precise concealed member of the one design in the world he had sworn under this very roof he had never seen, never known, never touched, and had described it, damningly, as a thing sunk, where no eye could see it, nor ever check it. The words of a man who knew the arch was hidden, and never dreamed it could be dug down to and found. The words hung in the hall's air. The knowing old builder on the committee said slowly into the silence, "And how, Mr. Dallow, would you come to know just what is sunk under the water at the foot of a pier of a bridge you swear you reckoned and built yourself, and that this woman says she showed to no living soul? For if you built it, the arch is there, and she is honest, and if you knew of the arch and did not build it, then you read her drawings, and she is honest still. And either way, sir, I should be glad to hear you tell it." And Mr. Hector Dallow, for the first time in 45 climbing years, had no answer, and the ruin of him came up into his face for the whole room to watch, and his easy assurance went all to pieces at once, the way a false span comes untrue, all in a moment, and past mending, and before everyone. The rest was quick, as such things are once the note is struck true. The Dowager Duchess turned her old head slowly in her chair and looked at the celebrated Mr. Dallow as at a light gone on in a room she had thought she knew, and then she looked at the gray companion she had cast out, and at the aged true model on the table with its honest hidden arch, and something worked in her proud, stricken face that had not been there in 20 years. The committee men drew back from Dallow as from a thing that soiled, and the Duke of Ravensmede, who had stood through the whole of it with his long-shut face opening by degrees like a hard frost breaking up, looked from the ruined man he had trusted to the quiet woman he had crushed, and understood, wholly and at once, the size of what he had done. He did not bluster, and he did not delay. He crossed the whole length of the great hall to where Susannah Thorne stood by her drawings, and before his mother and his sister and the committee and old Enoch at the door and the gathered servants, the Duke of Ravensmede made the dismissed companion a low, exact, deliberate bow, the bow a man makes to an equal, or to his better, and said, in a voice that carried, "Miss Thorne, I have done you a great and public wrong upon a liar's word, because I was too proud to look at your proof when you offered it, and too much a fool to know an honest woman when she stood before me and told me the truth. I ask your pardon. I do not expect it. You shall have from this house every reparation it is in my power to make, and the first of them is that every soul here shall know whose hand reckoned the bridge my mother's valley gave the world. And Susannah Thorne, who had not wept when they cast her out, stood very still and level by her father's drawings, and was at the last, after so long, seen. Mr. Dallow was finished that hour. The gold medal was recalled in disgrace before the grand opening ever came. The committee, shown Stott's sworn certificate and the dated book and the true master set, had their own men dam the water that very afternoon and open the footing of the middle pier, and found there exactly what Susannah had told them they would find, a common flat footing and no relieving arch at all, precisely where her design required the deep-sunk arch that would have held the span for 100 years, and they ruled the truth without a dissenting voice. And the great Mr. Dallow, whose whole edifice of fame had stood upon being the man who reckoned the boldest bridge in England, was unmade the moment the world learned he had reckoned nothing at all but had robbed a lost builder and his portionless daughter, and he lived long enough to be a byword, and went abroad, and is not worth the rest of the telling. The bridge itself was set right in the eyes of the world, re-entered under its true reckoning, and it was Susannah Thorne's own asking, when the amends were being made, and the Duke would have had the boldest bridge in the kingdom carry her name, that it should not. She asked instead that the true design be entered under her father's name, a name no fashionable soul had ever heard, Elias Thorne, master builder of the northern counties, who had chased that bold flat span for 20 years, and been taken at his board a poor man believing he had failed, and she asked, with a gentleness that shamed the room, that the failing bridge keep the dowager's name still, and be quietly taken down and built true at last under her own hand, so that it should no longer betray the old lady who had loved it, for the fault was Dallow's and never hers. And the old Dowager Duchess, hearing the gray creature she had turned out without a character ask, as her first act of power, that her enemy's comfort be preserved, did the hardest thing her whole proud life had ever cost her. She sent for Susannah Thorne alone, and owned her wrong plainly, and did not make it easy for herself by weeping over it, and asked, not as a duchess, but as one old unjust woman to a young wronged one, to be forgiven. And Susannah forgave her, and meant it, and the two of them were friends, in a plain grave way. For the year of life the old lady had left, and Susannah kept the fabric of her house for her to the end. The Duke was slower, because the deepest waters are. He had a great wrong to undo, and a proud cold habit of years to unlearn, and he set about both with the exactness he brought to everything, which is a truer sign of a man's heart than any easy warmth. And Susannah Thorne, restored now to no false grandeur, but to her plain, honored place as the keeper of the true fabric and the reckoner of the great bridge, watched the shut, watchful, betrayed man she had feared come slowly and wholly undone in the only way that lasts, which is by degrees and against his own long guard. He came to the works, at first on the business of the bridge that was being taken down and built true, and then on no business at all. He learned the names of things from her, the thrust and the haunch and the true line. He found, to his own great surprise, that the one place his unresting mind came quiet was on the scaffold and at the board where the gray woman worked, who wanted nothing from him, and who had taught him, without meaning to and at a price he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for, the thing his betrayal had taught him only by halves, that the false line and the true line are equally easy to swear to, and only the eye that has nothing to gain can tell them apart, and that the plausible, warm, charming ones are not the safe ones, and the safe one is the quiet one at the drawing board, who will not set her name to a false thing to save her own life. He had spent 20 years learning to distrust everyone for fear of the charming, and a plain woman with stone dust on her hands taught him, at the last, the far harder and better lesson, which is how to tell true from false, and so to trust again where trust is earned. He asked her to marry him at the bridge, among the new-set stone, one gold evening a year and more after the great hall, and Susannah Thorne, who had long ago put all such hopes away as things not meant for the likes of her, looked at him a long moment and then said yes, plainly, as she said everything. They were married in the autumn, quietly, from the court, in the small parish church, with old Reuben Stott fetched up in the Duke's own carriage to see his estimate drawer made a duchess, grumbling all the way that the world had gone soft in the head and pleased as ever he had been in his life. And Lady Cecilia laughed and wept together. And old Enoch stood at the back in his best coat, with his hat crushed in his hands. And the county offered a duke married to a dismissed companion out of a wheelwright's lodging, and no scandal it could prove, said everything that might be looked for behind its fans, a scheming creature, a designing nobody who had wormed her way in by playing on his grace's guilt, and then had to watch, across the years, the one spectacle gossip has no answer to. Two quiet people, visibly, durably, unfashionably happy. The new Duchess of Ravensmede never played the great lady, and never once tried. She kept her father's plain brass plumb-bob on the drawing board to the end of her days, and hung it true before she trusted a single wall, so that the works of the estate should be built to the true line and not to the fair-seeming one. And she took the ruined valley and the taken-down bridge and made of Ravensmede, in time, the soundest built estate in the county, where nothing was raised upon a false footing, and no man's name was ever set to another's reckoning. Her father's bold, true bridge she never bettered. Though she built for 30 years, it was always said, by those who knew a building, that the span he had chased for 20 years and she had fixed in a single winter and carried whole through a killing frost on the strength of her own denied warmth, was the truest founded bridge in England. And it took, at last, the name that a nobody builder had earned and never lived to wear. And she took, to the county's scandal, and then to its pride, any young person of the parish or tenantry with a wish to learn the trade, and taught them for nothing, saying her father had reckoned works for the love of it, and never turned one away, and she saw no reason a duchess should be less honest than a poor builder, nor a true line be kept only for the great who could pay. They had, together, better than 30 years, and the man the county had thought frozen for life grew warm so gradually and so wholly that the young who came after could never be, got to credit the old repute of him. To the end of his days, when any person was pressed upon him on the strength of a fine manner, or a fashionable name, or a plausible warm tongue, he would say only that he had learned his way of valuing people twice over, both times at a high price, once from a charming man of business who had robbed him with a smile and taught him to trust no one, and once, better, from a builder's daughter with stone dust on her hands who had taught him the far harder thing, how to know the true from the false and so to trust rightly again. For the false line and the true line are equally easy to swear to across a crowded room, and only the eye that has nothing to gain and hangs the plumb honest can tell them apart. And only a second winter surely will. His duchess outlived him by some years, and hung the plain brass plumb before she trusted a wall until her hand could hold it no more. And when she followed him, the county, which had once had every opinion of the great cold duke and none whatever of the grey companion he married, came in from 30 miles about, tenants and tradesmen and the taught-for-nothing grown gray now with families of their own, and stood along the road from the court to the church in an autumn wind for the builder's daughter. It was not for her rank the county had rank to spare. It was that in 35 years no soul in that country, gentle or simple, had ever once had from Susannah, Duchess of Ravensmede, a false thing sworn to be true, and it made hers the truest span in the county. There is a thing known to every honest builder of bridges, that a building stands true, in the end, only to the reckoning that raised it, and to no other, and at Ravensmede they tell the story still of the winter the great bridge came untrue, and the plain woman who gave the valley back its own true line. A charming, celebrated, universally trusted gentleman took a nobody's design and showed it to the world as his own genius, and wept his modest tears over it, and was believed against all comers, as charming gentlemen are, in every art he used, the beautiful lie, the borrowed tenderness for a failing lady, the true story turned neatly inside out, the great family's love and fear enlisted to crush the truth-teller, was defeated in the end, not by a magistrate and not by a cleverer schemer, but by a quiet keeper of a house's fabric, who knew that a bridge cannot be argued into standing on a footing it never had, and who, holding the one proof that could cost her everything, would not burn it to be warm. She was not saved by beauty, for she had little to spare, nor by fortune, for she had none, nor by anyone's belief in her word, for no one in that house believed it. She was saved by the plainest thing in the world, which is that a true reckoning stands whether or not a single soul is watching, and a false one comes down whatever name is driven into it. And whenever, long after, a fine name was believed against a plain one, or an honest woman's work was called a schemer's forgery, or a clever man forgot that somebody, somewhere, quietly keeps the true line, someone in that county would tell of the gray companion who would not warm herself at the cost of a lost man's bridge, and who let the stone answer when her own voice was worth nothing, and it made hers the truest span in the county. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly so you won't miss the next one.